Taoiseach, yesterday I got this letter from HBS, Health Business Services, in response to a parliamentary question. That's the interestingly named business division of the HSE, which seems like a contradiction in terms, I have to say. Why do we need a business section of the health service? But it was in response to a question about the contract that was awarded to CPL for recruitment in the context of COVID-19. As you know, they've been recruiting on rubbishy temporary contracts, as I would see them, people from the Call for Ireland, in nursing, people in contact tracing and testing. And if, by the way, you want to know why numbers aren't going down, you might look a little bit further than the fact that people on CPL contracts don't get sick pay, so they're under pressure to go into work. This is the people we're recruiting to the front line, is people who don't get sick pay. Right? No wonder we have cases. But that being aside, this letter confirms that CPL went through no tendering process for the contracts to recruit for the health service during COVID, but it was using existing procurement frameworks. This is all sort of jargon, and a framework agreement for recruitment services, blah, 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 right? Now, this is a hugely valuable contract, although they don't say how much it is worth, and it's worth noting that in the last week, CPL was sold to a Japanese multinational for 300 million, in excess of 300 million euro, and the two owners of CPL walk away with 110 million euro. Now, to what extent has the state inflated the value of that company and the huge payout that those people are getting by giving contracts where there's not even a tendering process, where they're recruiting to the health service for absolutely rubbishy contracts without even sick pay? Right? That's a scandal. As far as I'm concerned. And whatever excuse, I'll just conclude on this, Ciara, whatever excuse there might have been in the emergency in the early months of the pandemic, for that to continue to be the situation, that CPL are the vehicle for recruiting to the front line of the health services in the current situation, it's an absolute scandal and unacceptable.
I too will commend the HSE for its analysis and study in terms of a very worrying, deeply troubling female suicide cluster in Ballyfermot and in other areas that the Deputy identified, and the multiple factors that gave rise to the issues there. And I will engage with the HSE's Chief Executive to make sure, and to the Board, that this issue gets priority attention, because, of course, the lessons from this as well will inform wider application of policy and engagement and intervention, because that's a significant cluster in a relatively 10-week period, I think the Deputy said, which is a very short period of time. I will, in terms of the lack of pace, I will put the point you've made to me, to the HSE in relation to that. There isn't a shortage of resources. There are other issues outside of the remit of the HSE. In terms of housing and in terms of you referenced TUSLA, and that needs more assessment as well, in terms of the fear you said of removing children from families, and that caused considerable distress, so I will pursue those issues. They are grave, and they need focused action in terms of the lessons to be drawn from it, and whatever additional supports are required in that locality and amongst a cohort of women who could be under pressure should be provided across all fronts. In terms of Deputy Kelly's questions, first of all, as I said earlier, I think it's very important that the issue in relation to the gatherings on our streets arising from the takeaway points is addressed and is discussed and is brought to Cabinet, because I actually think it needed to be highlighted from a public health perspective, and the word has to go out that enforcement will intensify in terms of reoccurrence of this phenomenon, which has been ongoing now for about 2 weeks in the cities mainly, and does need to be addressed and responded to. Now, there is existing legislation in the 2 cities that have been identified this weekend in terms of bylaws, but they haven't really been, in terms of the fines and that. I think the Gardaí are reporting that crowds are dispersing, but they felt there was a significant change last weekend in behaviour. That might have been some degree of complacency because figures were better the previous week, and people felt maybe we've turned the corner in terms of reducing the incidents. We haven't. Numbers are back up. And remember, the numbers that we're seeing in the last 3 or 4 days would have been seeded maybe a week or 10 days ago. So that is of concern to us in terms of where we will be at the end of this month in relation to numbers. And numbers are critical. Like community transmission keeps if we keep community transmission low, we keep hospitalizations low, we keep ICU occupancy low for COVID, we enable us to keep schools going well and the non-COVID, particularly the non-COVID health services at the level that we want them to be. That is the objective. And we're doing this to try and keep the pressure on the virus to stop it from spreading and damaging people and damaging lives and livelihoods, as it has done since it started, not just here, but across the world. And if you look at what's happening in Europe, a lot of health systems are under real pressure in terms of their acute hospital systems and their ICUs right now. Thankfully, we're not in that position. We're, I think, the 3rd best at the moment in terms of the incidence of cases and the impact on hospitalizations and ICUs. We want to keep it that way, and we want to keep the performance as such that demands all our collective efforts, and people have sacrificed a lot to get here. In terms of the situation, in terms of 24-month terminally ill patients and people, and John Wall has been a strong advocate for this for quite some time. The Minister published the clinical report, and you have said that you support his more longer medium term. I don't think they're that long medium term ideas. The Department of Health now is currently examining, government considered this last week and is currently examining the issue. On the cervical check tribunal, I just have to say that the Menon report, as you know, gave rise to the need to establish negligence, and then that moved on to legislation that the last Oireachtas passed. The government have decided we'll consider it again next week at the Cabinet meeting. The Minister will bring a memorandum outlining where we are, the outstanding issues. It's down to recordance and statutory. You mentioned statute limitations. We don't believe that will be a significant an issue. We think we can deal with that.
We're running out of time.
But we will come back to this again next week. Yeah. So, and Deputy Boyd Barrett. Oh, sorry. If I could just say to you, and again, the HSE were under a lot of pressure in this House about the need to recruit quickly contact tracing staff and have a separate workforce as quickly as possible. So they can't, they're being called upon on all fronts in the House to do this, that and the other. And that's why I presume that they did what they did in terms of how they procured the services of CPL. But I can get that checked, but I presume that's the rationale, because there was pressure on from all fronts to make sure that we recruit and get a separate workforce in place to deal with the contact tracing and to deal with swabbing and to get testing to the level where now we can, our capacity exceeds demand at the moment. But again, we want to be ready for any further spike if one was to happen, to have the necessary workforce in place as quickly as we possibly can.
Thank you. We're over time, unfortunately.